Welcome to the series of seminar video tutorials by Dr. Gerd Hummer, MD, and MA in Theology. My name is Helmut Pilhar. I am the father of Olivia, and Dr. Hummer's appointed lecturer, on Germanische Heilkunde theory. Because of my personal destiny with my daughter Olivia, I have made it my task to bring you, dear friend, closer to the Germanische Heilkunde. I have been following this duty since 1995. In general, I am considered to be a Hummer loyalist. I do not want to skip or conceal anything important in my explanations, and I also do not want to add or reinterpret anything. I intend to pass this information to you, as well as I received it from Dr. Hummer. In this introduction to Germanische Heilkunde, I hope to captivate and inspire you, to never let go of it. The intended goal in Germanische Heilkunde is always the spontaneous healing, which cost nothing, and have no side effects. For this to happen, the patient must be able to play his or her primary role. Ignorance, as well known, does not protect against a law of nature. Both the patient and the therapist must understand these biological correlations. The objective of this chapter is to make it easier for anyone interested to get started learning this topic in this 2-hour seminar video. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this introductory lecture to Germanische Heilkunde by Doctor of Medicine and Master of Theology, Gerd Hummer. This lecture, newly designed by me in times of Corona, is addressed to those who are slowly waking up and asking themselves, what is actually happening worldwide, and whether it is based in reality. Dr. Hummer asked himself this question in 1981, with the submission of his habilitation at the University of Tübingen. In 1995, with the case of my daughter Olivia, I also asked myself this question. Then as now, the prevailing medicine played a central role. However, I also address this lecture to those who will bring light to this global fraud, as perhaps future decision makers and responsible persons. I want to recommend this lecture especially to these future important people, because with Dr. Hummer this madness could not have existed. This global fraud on humanity is, in fact, criminally provable. This lecture is not addressed to those who have an attention of a squirrel. Those who will switch themselves off and get distracted. My aim is rather to give you a general overview of the Germanische Heilkunde, so that you can speak from your life experience. Either you will then say, yes, it cannot be otherwise. Or you say, no, that is contradictory, because. In any case, you will be able to sense the enormous importance of Germanische Heilkunde for the whole of humanity. I expressly wish that this lecture be translated into all languages. Because the 5 biological laws of nature, discovered by Dr. Hummer, apply equally to all peoples of this earth. The knowledge about them should be accessible to all people. Dr. MD, Master of Theology, Gerd Hummer. The discoverer Dr. Hummer had unfortunately passed away on July 2, 2017. However, he has left us his legacy. Namely the Germanische Heilkunde, discovered by him. This purely biologically oriented healing science explains how our body works, in which we are stuck throughout our lives. Nobody knows how cancer develops, or how it disappears. Nobody knows where an athlete's foot comes from, or how it disappears. Nobody knows why the daughter is the only one in the family with allergies, and nobody else. We are stuck in our bodies all our lives. And nobody knows where the various diseases come from. In my opinion, there is no more important knowledge. And this is precisely what Dr. Hummer or the Germanische Heilkunde explains to us. If you, dear student, have understood this teaching, then you know why you have one symptom or another. If you know why, then you also know what to do to get well again. With the Germanische Heilkunde, neither doctor nor medicine stands between you and your health. No doctor can heal, and no medicine can cure. However, there is the so-called spontaneous healing with all illnesses, which the prevailing medicine is also not able to explain. So, there is a mechanism that makes us healthy. And this mechanism was discovered by Dr. Hummer. In Germanische Heilkunde, spontaneous healing is the declared goal. Only you can heal yourself by eliminating the conflict you have personally suffered. In the rarest cases, we would need emergency medicine. Humanity will always be grateful to Dr. Hummer for his legacy. For this reason he will never be forgotten, and therefore it can be said that Dr. Hummer will already be counted among the immortals. The birth of new medicine. The discovery of Germanische Heilkunde began for Dr. Hummer with a terrible loss conflict for his 19-year-old son Dirk, in 1978. He was fatally killed with a rifle shot by an Italian king's son, who had gone mad. A short time later, Dr. Hummer fell ill with testicular cancer. As an internist, he was immediately convinced that his cancer must have been related to the horrible death of his beloved son. This was the birth of Germanische Heilkunde. In 1981, he submitted his discovery in a postdoctoral thesis to the University of Tübingen. However, the initial enthusiasm of the university professors, to finally have a logical explanation of cancer formation in front of them, quickly turned into a strangely narrow-minded rejection. Until today, they refuse a correct scientific verification on the next best case. In their breach of law, this University of Tübingen is supported by the mainstream media, ruling politics, and judiciary. The deep state has intervened in this matter from the beginning. As tragic as the discovery of Germanische Heilkunde started, as tragic is the dispute about the legal application of this wonderful discovery, for many cancer patients until today. To date, it is not officially recognized and cannot be legally practiced. Therapists are forbidden to help patients with this discovery. The case of Olivia Pilhar. In 1995, our then 6-year-old daughter Olivia was diagnosed with cancer, and we parents wanted to opt for Germanische Heilkunde by Dr. Hummer. But we were forbidden to do so. We parents were chased through half of Europe with our cancer-stricken daughter and her 2 siblings, 3 small children, to finally catch us with Interpol and treat our Olivia with chemo, against our will forcibly. The story around our daughter Olivia went almost worldwide through the media. My intended audience is you. My name is Helmut Pilhar. I am Olivia's father and a lecturer on Germanische Heilkunde theory, appointed by Dr. Hummer. Actually, I am a technician, and I never had anything to deal with medicine before 1995. But my child was taken away from me, and raped in front of my eyes, by the state. Therefore, I made it my mission to explain the Germanische Heilkunde to the public, to the best of my knowledge and conscience. Dr. Hummer appointed me as University Lecturer of Germanische Heilkunde theory, at his private university Sonderfjord. The authorities took away Dr. Hummer's university and my title, given to me by the rector of this university. The intended audience of my educational work is not the patient, because I am not a therapist. We also do not have a clinic, where we could send the sick. We are not allowed to have one. The ruling system has forbidden us. At the moment the motto is, get it, or stay in conventional medicine. But my intended audience is not the therapist either. A therapist must be able to do much more than I can. He must have been trained on the patient, and that was also forbidden to Dr. Hummer. He was disbarred in 1986, because of not renouncing the new medicine and not converting to conventional medicine. So, Dr. Hummer was not allowed to practice, nor was he allowed to train therapists. So, there are no therapists trained by Dr. Hummer. But to practice Germanische Heilkunde, we also need high-tech medicine. For example, in the form of the brain CT. We need permanent medication from case to case, in case of missing thyroid tissue or diabetes, for example. We need surgery from case to case, such as in the case of impending intestinal obstruction. But what we need above all is legality. Germanische Heilkunde is legal if we are allowed to choose it freely at the next best clinic, and if we are also allowed to use it for our children. But we are not allowed to choose freely for ourselves, nor for our children. The deep state had already forbidden it in 1981. So, at the moment, neither do we have a clinic nor do we have competently trained therapists. But, nobody can forbid you to solve your conflict with your employer or with your mother-in-law. Nobody can forbid you to become healthy again. So, if I may advise you, make the Germanische Heilkunde your hobby, so that you know in case of a conflict shock. As a side effect of the study of Germanische Heilkunde, you will also lose the fear of the symptoms, and you will be able to spare yourself consequential conflicts. In conventional medicine, the most common metastases are lung metastases. Metastases, which cannot exist at all the way their origin is explained. In reality, metastases are nothing more than secondary conflicts, and thus secondary cancers. Caused by the cruel treatment of patients, by the so-called gods in white. Lung cancer has as its cause a fear of death conflict. By the brutal diagnosis opening of the, you have cancer. The patient associates death. Now I must die. But suppose you can interpret the symptoms correctly and know that, for example, blood in the stool is an unmistakable sign of the healing phase of colon cancer, that you have already been able to resolve the anger conflict. In that case, you are not afraid of death. Instead, you know that you are on the best way to recovery, and that the symptom blood in the stool is instead a good reason to rejoice. So much for my introduction. Now I would like to show you the common threads in Germanische Heilkunde, and thus make it easier for you to get started with this topic. Germanische Heilkunde. What is it about? In a nutshell, one can say that Germanische Heilkunde is about the cause of the disease, and thus about the causal therapy. It is about those diseases that arise by themselves, including cancer, chronic diseases, allergies, and psychoses. Germanische Heilkunde does not apply to poisoning, injury, and not to extreme malnutrition, such as scurvy. There is also no need to resolve a conflict in this case. According to the medical journal, Medical Tribune, there are about 1,000 different medicines in the world. All medicines have their own therapy. Nobody knows the cause of the disease, but they all treat it merrily. We, on the other hand, are accused of having no therapy at all. We would treat the patient neither manually nor medicamentously. Therefore, we could have no therapy at all. In reality, we have the therapy par excellence, namely the causal one. You, dear student, will still be able to recognize that it is much cheaper to swallow a pill than to solve your conflict, for example with your employer, your mother-in-law, your life partner, or with your child. To put one's own life back in order is much more effort than to stretch out one's arm to the doctor for an injection. Up to now, the patients were treated. In the Germanische Heilkunde, the patients emancipate themselves to acting. The linchpin is the biological conflict shock, DHS. The cause of those diseases that arise on their own is monocausal, and therefore verifiable, the biological conflict shock. Dr. Hummer named this biological conflict shock after his deceased son, Dirk Hummer syndrome, DHS. Through his tragic death, Dr. Hummer observed this conflict shock for the first time on his own body. This DHS always has three criteria. It has been felt highly acute dramatic. It has been felt isolative. And one has been caught on the wrong foot. With the biological conflict, we are immediately sympathicotinous, in stress. With cold hands. Now a sensible biological special program starts, which causally helps us to solve this moment of shock. These sensible biological special programs, SBSs, do this in three different ways. Either by cell proliferation, as in colorectal or breast cancer, for example. Or by cell atrophy, for example in coronary arteries or gastric ulcers. Or by functional failure, that is without cell growth or cell breakdown, as for example in diabetes or in paralysis of the skeletal muscles. These conflict-active symptoms visibly increase with the intensity and duration of the conflict. Thus, the longer the conflict lasts, the larger the tumor or cellular atrophy becomes, and the more pronounced the loss of function becomes. Our body does not do this because of any malignancy of Mother Nature, but for the sole reason of resolving this biological conflict, either by specific functional enhancement or specific functional loss. Basically, the specific organ symptom is the specific therapy for the cause, and helps to solve this biological conflict. If one would only fight the symptom in this conflict-active phase, without solving the conflictive cause, the symptom would appear again. Nature in our body wants to solve this conflict, period. There is no alternative to natural laws, period. Therefore, the main focus must be on the cause. Because it is from the cause, this personal and individual conflict, that the successful therapy must be derived. The conflict resolution initiates the healing phase. With conflict resolution, the famous weight falls from the patient's soul. It stops cell proliferation, it stops cell loss, and it stops functional failures. Cancer begins with the conflict. With the conflict resolution, cancer stops. It is so simple. This principle is easy for everyone to understand, and scientifically easy to prove. How do you resolve conflicts? As individual as people are, so individual are their conflicts. And thus conflict solutions are always individual. There can be no patent solution. Because what became a biological conflict for the one, for example the abandonment of the life partner, the other can accept with a certain relief, without being touched by it conflictively. And what would be a conflict solution for one, for example the return of the life partner, can be felt by the other as a new burden. We usually resolve our conflicts instinctively, because of the compulsive thinking that the biological conflict shock has given us. All thoughts immediately revolve around the problem. Patients dream of their unresolved conflicts at night. Basically, the entire organism is oriented towards conflict resolution. We do not rest until a solution to this problem comes to our minds. Such as getting divorced and starting a new life. Sometimes we solve our conflicts by chance. By chance, the lightning hits the mother-in-law during the walk, and suddenly the world looks wholly different. But now, with a knowledge of these biological connections, we can find out precisely this biological conflict, and derive a patient-specific therapy from this conflict. The core of this therapy is that the stone falls from the patient's soul. So, we help him find his way out of his conflict with wise advice, because then cancer stops without us having treated the patient somehow in the conventional sense. By the way, this wise advice is the royal art in the Germanische Heilkunde. With the resolution of the conflict, however, the healing phase with its specific symptoms now begins. These healing phases are generally vagatonic, and with fever. Edema deposits occur in the brain, at the site of the Hummer focus and the organ. These swellings cause brain symptoms and pain at the organ level. In such a healing phase, the patient is weak and tired. After all, he has to recover from the exhausting conflict active phase, where he used up his power reserves. Healing phases are accompanied by inflammation of the tissue. The previously formed tumors are degraded tuberculously, and the preceding necroses are refilled under the swelling. In general, the conflict active phase is less frequent than the healing phase. Now in the healing phase, the patient thinks he is sick. The healing phase lasts about as long as the conflict active phase lasted. In the middle of the healing phase, the crises also always occur, which we will look at in a little more detail later. Our nervous system. To understand the rest, I need to explain a few basic things first. Everybody has a nervous system. We have a voluntary nervous system. With this we can speak voluntarily, move voluntarily, stand up, walk, sit down. And we have an involuntary nervous system. This controls our heartbeat, the movement of the intestines, the widening and narrowing of the vessels. In other words, hot and cold hands. We can't willfully give ourselves cold hands one day, and hot hands the next. Try it once. It is not possible. And this involuntary is also called the vegetative nervous system, and itself has two parts. The vegetative nervous system. It has a stress portion, called the sympathetic nervous system, and a rest portion called the parasympathetic or vagus nervous system. This two-part autonomic nervous system originates from the spinal cord, innervates all organs, and thus, our brain can switch the organs from stress to rest and back again. There are also so-called ergotropic organs. The brain, the heart, the striated skeletal muscles, and so on. These organs are innervated in stress, and there are so-called trophotropic organs, for example, the digestive system. This is innervated in the resting phase. And it is this involuntary vegetative nervous system that we will now deal with. From now on, we will leave out the voluntary nervous system completely. The so-called diseases also do not depend on our conscious, but our unconscious will. The Hummer's compass. With the following picture, we have the most important of the Germanische Heilkunde compressed. We also call this scheme Hummer's compass. It is in principle a vegetative coordinate system, in which we can find ourselves at any time. On the x-axis, we have plotted the time. So, Monday, Tuesday, or February, March, April. On the y-axis, we have plotted the intensity of the stress part, that is the sympathetic nervous system. And down, we plotted the intensity of the resting part, that is the vagus or parasympathetic nervous system. The absolute health. In Utoni we are absolutely healthy. Here is the normal day-night rhythm. In the daytime, we are sympathicotonic, we are stressed, we have to work and accomplish something. We have to go hunting. We typically have constricted vessels and thus cooler extremities. And at night, we are vagatonic, the body is resting. We typically have dilated vessels and thus warmer extremities. You know this yourself. Once you go to bed later than your partner, around 4 o'clock in the morning. Your partner has been sleeping for a long time, and you snuggle up to him. You realize how boiling hot your partner is. Your sleeping partner is fully vagatonic, but he is not sick. The biological conflict shock. With the DHS, every sensible biological special program starts, no matter whether one calls the symptom diabetes, breast cancer, allergy, psychosis, or pimples. With this biological conflict shock, our vegetative system immediately switches to permanent stress. The affected person is immediately wide awake. He immediately has ice-cold hands. He can't get the bite down. The level of the psyche. On the psyche, the patient immediately has obsessive thinking. All thoughts revolve around his conflict. From now on, he has trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. He dreams of his conflict. His brain searches for a solution to the problem. The brain level. In this second shock, the Hummer focus arises on the brain level, and can be photographed immediately in the computer tomography. And this Hummer focus in the brain is proof that the diseases, which develop by themselves, here in the conflict shock, have their cause. So, the diseases have nothing to do with heredity, contagion, carcinogenic substances, wrong sleeping place, or bad nutrition. The association at the moment of shock. The conflict content associated in the moment of shock now determines the localization of the Hummer focus in the brain, and thus the localization of the special program on the organ level. Example: colorectal cancer. Suppose one has associated here a morsel conflict or anger conflict. In that case, one has the Hummer focus in the brainstem, and one reacts with cell proliferation of the intestinal villi, thus with intestinal cancer. Example: breast cancer. If one has felt a worry or dispute conflict, the Hummer focus is in the cerebellum, and one reacts with cell proliferation of the mammary gland cells, that is with a mama CA. Example: bone cancer. If one has associated a severe self-value collapse, the Hummer focus strikes the cerebral medulla, and one reacts with cellular atrophy of the bone, that is, with bone cancer. Example: neurodermatitis. If one has suffered a separation conflict, one has the Hummer focus in the sensory cortex center of the cerebral cortex. One reacts with cell atrophy of the outer skin, that is with dry neurodermatitis. Example: multiple sclerosis. If one has suffered a motor conflict, for example of not being able to escape, one has the Hummer focus in the motor cortex center of the cerebral cortex, and one reacts with the functional failure of paralysis. For example, multiple sclerosis. The Hummer focus in the brain. The conflict active phase. If this Hummer focus is sharp-ringed, as seen here, then the conflict is active, that is not resolved. The healing phase. If the conflict could be solved, then this brain relay repairs itself by edema storage. These sharp rings are lost, and the brain relay turns dark in the brain CT. In the brain CT, we can see whether the cause is still present or has already been resolved, and the patient is now in the so-called healing phase. The Hummer focus on the organ. Spine. However, this Hummer focus can also be photographed on the organ itself. This patient has two such Hummer focus in the spine, more precisely in the intervertebral disc. On the left, you can see necrosis, so this conflict has existed for a long time. The upper arrow points to a well-visible shooting disc. This active conflict has happened recently. So, you can time when the conflict must have happened. On the psyche, this corresponds to a central self-devaluation collapse, thus concerning the own person, one has failed, or one was screwed. In the fur of a dog. This Hummer focus was originally bullet-shaped. The single hair was light, dark, dark. It was as if concentric circles had been painted into the dog's fur, with a felt tip pen. Unfortunately, no photo was taken at the time. The fur or hair corresponds to the outer skin, so separation. Here already a so-called hanging healing seems to be present. This dog wanted to be separated from my hand, which kept pushing him into the dog crate, and from which he kept escaping. He wanted to avoid going into the dog crate, and he wanted to be separated from my hand. With Germanische Heilkunde, we can translate the organ level, whether in humans or animals. It is also about biological conflicts, which are felt identically by all individuals. About this interanimal language of man and animal, I will explain more in a moment. Neurodermatitis. Or here, the outer skin, neurodermatitis, the healing of a separation conflict. The associated Hummer focus would be found in the sensory cortex center of the cerebral cortex. On the leaf of a lemon tree. The leaf of a lemon tree stood in the winter draft on a window, Scylla, a Viennese biology student. She brought this leaf to her biology professor, who was just puzzling about what it could be. As you can see, dear student, the Germanische Heilkunde applies equally to humans, animals, and plants. The plants only lack the head brain. The plants have only the organ brain, which we humans also have. But you also see how skillfully the mainstream, in its decades-long hate tirades against the miracle healer Hummer, has consistently withheld this important information from you. About the Hummer focus and about the fact that one can read the organ illnesses of the patient with his help out of the computer tomography. About this, the complete mainstream has itself silent for decades. And with the mainstream also the politicians, the courts, the ministries were silent. All of them acted as if they had never heard anything about it. The worst lie is the concealed truth. The tissue types, the germ layers. A house is built of different materials. The basement with concrete blocks, to withstand the earth and water pressure. The walls with baked clay tiles protect the living space from climatic influences. The roof is made of ceramic to withstand the wind and rain for many years. The rain gutters are made of copper sheets. Similarly, our body is composed of 4 different types of tissue, the cotyledons. You see here the scientific diagnosis charts of Dr. Hummer. Each cotyledon was assigned a certain color. You can reduce the clinical dictionary Stirrumbell to this diagnosis chart and have the advantage of systematization of all so-called diseases. There is the glandular tissue, yellow, which is controlled by the brainstem. There is the glandular tissue, yellow-orange, which is controlled by the cerebellum. There is the connective tissue, orange, which is controlled by the cerebral medulla. And there is the squamous epithelium, red, which is controlled by the cerebral cortex. The functional failures such as paralysis, diabetes, loss of sense of smell, etc., are also controlled from the cerebral cortex, which is why this group is also red. The lung with its squamous epithelium. Our organs are often composed of several tissue types. In Germanische Heilkunde, the different organ parts are represented according to the different germ layers colored. We see 2 different colors in the lungs, yellow for the pulmonary alveoli, glandular tissue, and red for the bronchial mucosa, squamous epithelium. If the conventional medical diagnosis is now lung cancer, one must ask, is it an alveolar lung round cancer from the yellow group, or a bronchial carcinoma from the red group? The bronchial mucosa, like any squamous epithelium, is controlled by the cerebral cortex. The squamous epithelium ulcerates in the conflict-active phase, and is replenished in the healing phase. Under the swelling. In the case of a preceding large conflict load, this healing swelling may well close a bronchial branch, so that it leads to a lack of ventilation of the lungs. This is called bronchial CA by the conventional physician. In reality, however, this is a healing phase symptom. Because at the end of the healing phase, this mucosal swelling spontaneously recedes. Therefore, this patient must have either male territorial fear conflict, or a female scare-fright conflict resolved, and warm hands. Depending on the hormone situation. The lung with its glandular tissue. In contrast, alveolar lung nodular carcinoma arises in the conflict-active phase. The pulmonary alveoli are part of the glandular tissue, which is controlled from the brainstem. In the conflict-active phase, the glandular tissue makes cell proliferation. And in the healing phase, there is tuberculous degradation. So, a patient with a pulmonary round must have active fear of death conflict, and cold hands. The skin with its squamous epithelium. The outer layer of the skin is the squamous epithelium. Like the bronchial mucosa, the outer skin is controlled by the cerebral cortex. In the active phase, the squamous epithelium ulcerates, and the skin becomes rough and is dry. In the healing phase, the squamous epithelium is replenished with swelling and inflammation. This subheading includes the symptoms of atopic dermatitis, eczema, cold sore, wart, basal cell carcinoma, etc. The symptoms of the outer skin always have a separation conflict as their cause. The skin with its glandular-like tissue. While to the hypodermis, dermis, yellow-orange, belong the symptoms like melanoma, acne, shingles, skin fungus, etc. In the active phase, the glandular-like tissue makes cell proliferation, and in the healing phase tuberculous degradation. This subheading includes cutaneous tuberculosis or leprosy. The glandular-like tissue is controlled from the cerebellum. The dermis is concerned with the violation of integrity, such as defilement, disfigurement, or attack conflicts. The breast with its squamous epithelium. The breast has milk ducts, lined with squamous epithelium. The cerebral cortex again controls this squamous epithelium. Inflammation is always a healing phase symptom. Thus, the woman with mastitis or introductal mammary CA has warm hands and a separation conflict, associated with the breast in solution. The breast with its glandular-like tissue. The mammary glands are developmentally remodeled sweat glands of the dermis, and belong to the cerebellar gland-like tissue. As with the dermis, cell proliferation is present during the conflict-active phase. In the healing phase, the nodule undergoes tuberculous degradation, just like melanoma of the dermis. So, the compact mammary gland CA gets bigger and bigger in the conflict-active phase, and the affected person has cold hands. The supporting tissue is connective tissue. The connective tissue, which includes bone, is controlled from the cerebral medullary. In the active phase, necrosis or osteolysis occurs here. The bone marrow more or less stops blood production, and the patient has anemia. In the healing phase, the tissue is replenished with swelling, which is very painful in the bone. Usually, the affected person is now diagnosed with bone cancer. The bone marrow produces blood excessively, and leukemia is present. So, a leukemia patient has a resolved self-devaluation conflict and warm hands. At the end of the healing phase, the swelling on the bone goes down. But the bone remains thicker at this point than it was before. The blood count has also been renormalized at the end of the healing phase. Loss of function affects nerves. The muscle is part of the connective tissue, but is controlled by the motor cortex center of the cerebral cortex. The cause of multiple sclerosis, MS, is a motor conflict of not being able to escape, not being able to defend, not being able to hold on, etc. In the active phase, there is a loss of function. Signals from the brain no longer reach the muscle. In the recovery phase, the paralysis seems to worsen due to the edema in the cerebral cortex. In the crisis, the epileptic seizure occurs. At the end of the healing phase, the function has returned, and the paralysis has disappeared. The hunter and the prey animal. Now we come from the theory, back to the practice with the hunter and the prey animal. Both are in stress and sympathicotinous. Nevertheless, there is a considerable difference. The hunter has waylaid the prey animal and was prepared for the forthcoming chase. Nothing has caught the hunter on the wrong foot. The hunter will not become ill, therefore. However, the prey animal has a conflict, and it immediately starts a special program with him. It now is about his life. The 3 criteria were fulfilled. Highly acute dramatically, now it is about its life with the prey animal. Isolated felt, nobody there who could help the prey animal from the trouble. The hunter has targeted him and nobody else. Caught on the wrong foot, the prey animal has noticed this hunter too late. The biological conflict shock passes the mind. Before one comes to thinking, the conflict has already happened. The humor focus has arisen in the brain, and the special program has started. The vegetative nervous system, which one cannot control willfully, inevitably switches immediately to permanent stress. The individual immediately mobilizes all strength to solve the problem, to escape the hunter, and this is where nature's therapy begins. The stress phase is there to solve the cause. The prey animal is now on the run. It is wide awake and has ice-cold paws. The heart is innervated, the blood pressure rises. The brain is innervated, the prey animal tries to trick the hunter, to escape from him. The prey animal has compulsive thinking. The musculature is innervated, the prey animal flees. The digestive system is at rest, the prey animal does not feel hunger, just as it does not feel tiredness. Try to put yourself in the prey animal's place. What conflict does this prey animal associate with? No one can say, except the prey animal itself. It can have reacted with fear of death and lung rounds. But it could also have reacted with a motor conflict of not being able to escape. In the brain CT, we could recognize it immediately, based on the localization of the humor focus. On the other hand, on the organ level, shortly after the conflict shock, no symptom can be diagnosed for a long time after the conflict shock. How does the story continue? The chase already lasts hours, days. For weeks, the hunter is behind. The prey animal finds no rest, is in constant fear and alarm, has trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. The prey animal builds up a conflict load. It emaciates. It wears out. After weeks or months, the conventional physician also diagnoses a corresponding symptom, such as lung cancer or paralysis. The individual is an inseparable unit. Actually, one must imagine this hummer's compass threefold and completely synchronously on the 3 levels, psyche, brain, organ. With this system individual, we have an overdetermined system. What does overdetermined mean? If we want to describe a straight line in space mathematically, we need 2 known points in space for this. With this, one can say where the straight line comes from and where it will go in space. But if you have only 1 known point, you cannot say anything about the straight line, except this 1 point. This is what conventional medicine does with its patients. They look deeper and deeper into the organ level. Deeper and deeper into the cell. They know more and more about less and less, until one day they know everything about nothing. If it were not so tragic, this nonsense could be really funny. We in the Germanische Heilkunde proceed like in mathematics, just scientifically. Through the individual himself, we have 2 known and interrogable points, namely the organ level and the patient's psyche. Since the individual is not divisible, we can add DHS, active phase, conflict resolution, healing phase, crisis, recovery, etc. We can always conclude from one level to the other levels. Always and no matter which symptom. Dr. Hummer has written more detailed information on his scientific diagnosis chart. Moreover, in Germanische Heilkunde, we have a third parallel level, the brain level with the Hummer focus. This Hummer focus is disc-shaped and sharp-ringed, always in the conflict-active sympathicotonic phase, edematized, always in the vagatonic healing phase. Thus, we have an overdetermined diagnostic procedure. Who now still wants to claim that we in the Germanische Heilkunde would not proceed scientifically, has no idea of science, or defames on purpose. If you as a housewife ask your husband to carry out the manure bucket, and he has to sneeze after done work, you know that it has stunk your husband. If you do not want to believe my statement, then ask your husband. He will confirm it for you. Sneezing is the crisis of the conflict, it stinks to me concerning the nasal mucosa. I ask you, dear student, do you have a psyche, soul? The term individual means the indivisible. If one separates the body from the psyche, the body is lifeless and dead. What happens then with the psyche? About it the most different belief theories entwine. Whether the psyche or soul continues to exist without body or not, nobody can answer scientifically. In Germanische Heilkunde, the individual is understood and treated as an inseparable unity between organs and psyche. The organ symptom is the consequence of a corresponding psychological, biological, conflict shock. The course of the disease is synchronous on the level of the psyche and the organ level. In conventional medicine, on the other hand, the patient is divided into psyche and organs. We have organ doctors who are not interested in the patient's psyche, and even think that cancer has nothing to do with it at all. Then this organ medicine is further subdivided into the specialists, urologist, neurologist, nephrologist, specialist for the left nostril, and specialist for the right nostril. And we have their psychologists, who again do not understand, or do not want to understand, anything about the organ level of the patient. With this approach, our present-day medicine has divided the individual, and thus made it controllable, precisely according to the motto, divide and rule. Since conventional medicine does not want to comprehend the cause of the disease, it uses statistics. It concludes, for example, that from 100 smokers, so and so many falls ill with lung cancer. In her statistics, however, she completely disregards the psyche of the affected person. However, a statistic that does not consider such an important factor is without any value. Example, in Austria's Burgenland, Lake Neusiedl is home to storks. However, this stork population is decreasing more and more every year. Due to the rural exodus of Burgenländer to Vienna, the birth rate in Burgenland is also declining at the same time. The two declining statistical curves, stork population and birth rate, are congruent. Now, one could statistically conclude that the storks bring the children. There would certainly be people who would also believe this. With this linkage of two facts, stork population and birth rate, one disregarded the reproduction of humans. Babies do not come from storks. The linkage between stork and baby is incorrect. The fact that the person concerned has now got his lung cancer because of a fear of death experience, and cannot solve this fear of death, because the hunter is still after him, that does not interest the conventional medicine in the least. Conventional medicine counters that it only wants to work scientifically and deletes the psyche from the term individual. On the other hand, they need only ask the patient. He would confirm it to them immediately. Yes. Since that happened, I have these symptoms. On the other hand, I don't smoke. It is conventional medicine that consistently refuses to proceed scientifically, finally. Emaciation, cachexia. Emaciation is a typical picture in cancer patients. This lady had several cancers. However, she was able to manage to resolve her conflicts and get through her healing phases. As you can see, she can laugh chubby-cheeked again. She has regained the weight she lost. Solution of the cause of the disease. When the prey animal was finally able to shake off the hunter, the stone falls from the prey animal's soul and it enters the healing phase through conflict resolution. The healing phase. Now, the prey animal gets warm paws again, appetite, and can sleep redeemed. The body recovers from the previous stress phase. It regains the lost weight. The so far bullet-shaped and sharp-ringed Hummer focus in the brain now store edema up to the crisis. With the crisis, this edema is squeezed out, and subsequently scar tissue, glia, is stored. The brain relay is scarred at the end of the healing phase, but this does not bother. As long as one was conflict active, so long will the now inevitably following healing phase last. This healing phase cannot be avoided. Possibly, one can intervene medicamentously controlling. The two areas under the curve correspond to each other. The longer the conflict lasted, the more intense it was felt, the longer the healing phase will last, the more intense it will be, and the more violent the crises will be. If you were conflict active for one day, thus drawing on your energy reserves for one day, you need 1 day of rest to recover. This 1 day of vagatonia is not worth mentioning, and one does not run to the doctor for it. If one was conflict active for 1 week, one will not find the issue with 1 day of rest, and will need 1 week of rest. This is then called, for example, flu. And one gets a sick note from the doctor. If one were 3 months conflict active, the healing phase would last 3 months. Then, however, one has with certainty a bad diagnosis in conventional medicine, such as cancer. The biological language of Mother Nature. Note: the mystery about the different diseases was hidden in the history of development. As I have already mentioned, Dr. Hummer had discovered 5 biological laws of nature in the living. All diseases, no matter which individual, run almost identically according to these natural laws. Those creatures that are very closely related to us humans also have the same organs as we do. And why should Mother Nature have written a different program for their organs than for us humans? The lion needs the lung for breathing, just like we humans. To be able to understand the cause and the biological sense of the different SBSs, we must learn to understand this biological and the interanimal language of Mother Nature. This language is also not utterly foreign to us. We even have many idioms in our language usage that hit the nail on the head. It's in my stomach. I couldn't get through it. I cut my teeth on it. You broke my heart then. I was paralyzed. It is not only us adults who feel this morsel, disfigurement, self-value, separation, and territorial conflicts, but also the unborn in the womb, and the infant, and the toddler. These are biological conflicts, not psychological problems. And they are also felt by the animal, because we humans are related to all creatures of this planet Earth, in the history of development. The monotheistic world religions, which in my opinion are nothing other than the blueprint for the one world government, have taught us humans, that we are the crowning glory of creation. And that all other creatures are at our service. The animal and the plant were explained to the commodity. Many people therefore also have a problem with the idea, that we are related to the monkey. As a software engineer, which I actually am, I have basically no problem at all with this idea. The monkey breathes, eats, reproduces, plays with its children, defends its children, etc., as I do. As a confessing heathen who regards the creation as holy, the question rather arises for me. What is the difference between living and dead matter? Or more precisely formulated, how did life in and of itself come into being? The origin of life is a mystery, and in my eyes holy. No matter with which creature. It is evident that man cannot have come into being at the snap of a finger, as in the film Terminator. Instead, the entire life must have developed from a primordial cell. Embryonic development. How do we want to know what our ancestors looked like in the distant past? Ernst Haeckel formulated the sentence 100 years ago, ontogenesis is a recapitulation of phylogenesis. In other words, the development of the embryo in the womb is a recapitulation of the phylogenesis. So, we all have gone through the complete human development from our conception, fertilization of the maternal egg cell by the paternal sperm, over several 100 million years, in the womb of our mother in a time lapse of 9 months of pregnancy. If we look back now into embryonic development, we look back thus into the development history of humanity. Thus we can say, that our primeval ancestor must have been such a ring-shaped and worm-like being. It had a primordial mouth through which it ingested the food, and also excreted the morsel of excrement. Sea anemones still look like this today. In principle, this little animal was a single digestion machine, and had only one in the head, namely eat and multiply. This little animal lived in the primeval sea. The primordial sea. Let us consider this ring-shaped being. Its right organ side tried to take up the good food morsel, and its left organ side tried to excrete the bad excrement morsel again. Its organs consisted of glandular tissue. His brain was the brainstem, our oldest brain part today. The brain relays are arranged in the brainstem, in the same order as the individual organs on the organ level. The right brainstem thus controls the right organ side, and the left brainstem the left organ side. There is no crossing from the brain to the organ level with the brainstem. At that time, this worm did not know any social behavior. So, it was not distinguished yet between partner and mother-child. Therefore, the handedness does not play a role in glandular tissue until today. The rupture of this ring form took place later at the place of our today's larynx. We have inherited everything from this ancestor. Even today, as far as glandular tissue is concerned, we are concerned with the morsel conflict. Also today, we try with the glandular tissue on the right side of the brain stem to take in the good food morsel, and the left side in the brain stem to get rid of the bad fecal morsel. With the middle ear, which is also glandular tissue, the right ear is concerned with the good information morsel that you want to take in, and the left middle ear is about the bad information morsel that you can't get rid of. Likewise, angina on the right means that you have finally gotten the good morsel and have been able to swallow it. Angina on the left would mean that you finally got rid of a bad morsel. From the mouth and throat, the right side continues with the pharynx and stomach. One need only visualize the path of the food morsel. So, a thickening of the stomach wall means that I can't take in the morsel I've already swallowed after all. The pancreas would be the fight for the morsel, for example inheritance conflicts. The cut is at the small intestine. From the large intestine, it's a matter of getting rid of the morsel of feces. The further towards the rectum, the sneakier and shittier this turd you can't get rid of. In the past, the rectum led into the left mouth area, but today we have the rectum at the end of the digestive tract. In these special programs, in the conflict active phase, we have cell proliferation and thus function amplification, which is also the biological sense. Additional mucus and additional digestive juice is produced, so that the morsel slides in or out better, and that a stuck morsel can still be digested. Whether the colon carcinoma today lies in our abdomen on the left or on the right, has nothing to do with our handedness. Figuratively speaking, the colon lies completely on the left organ side of our ancestor, and has as conflict content an ugly and indigestible anger, which one cannot get rid of. For example, one is unjustly accused of something. Correspondingly, the Hummer focus in the brain stem is also located on the left side. The land. The inner skins. Our ancestor left the primordial sea and conquered the land. He needed additional organs, the inner skins, to protect himself against sharp stones. The inner skins include the dermis, the peritoneum, the pleura, and the pericardium. Accordingly, it is a matter of violations of integrity. That is, sullying, disfigurement and attack conflicts. The tissue is glandular-like. For these additional organs, an additional control unit was added, the cerebellum. The mammary glands are developmentally converted sweat glands, which is why we also find the mammaceae in the cerebellum. So with the cerebellum, the first social behavior was programmed in the care conflict about partner or mother-child. From now on, the handedness is decisive and remains so until the cerebral cortex. From now on, there is also a crossing from the brain to the organ level. So, the mammaceae on the left is in the right cerebellum. If now the partner lies with broken bones on the ground and can provide no more even for his food intake, this sensible biological special program of the milk gland starts with his partner belonging to him. The biological sense of it is to be able to produce by a cell multiplication of the milk glands a more of mother's milk and to be able to give with it to the loved, now however heavily hurt partner, a higher chance of survival. The sclera. Similarly in the case of the dermis. After a corresponding conflict of defilement or disfigurement, the conflict active phase with its cell proliferation is the biological sense of this special program. It is built the wall outward simply thicker, to be able to protect itself thereby better. The melanoma itself is not the problem. It becomes problematic, if the cause is not solved. Because then the melanoma gets bigger and bigger, or it appears again and again. Even if you cut away this melanoma but do not solve the conflict, this melanoma will develop again at the same place. As I said, Mother Nature wants to solve the conflict with this symptom. And as long as the cause remains, the symptom remains. When the doctor announces surgery, we have to remove your ovarian cancer surgically. The patient may react by attacking her abdomen. They want to cut open my abdomen. Her peritoneum now develops a flat-growing tumor, called mesothelioma. And the wall to the outside thus thickens. If the surgeon finds this mesothelioma during the ovarian surgery, the surgeon thinks that ovarian cancer has already spread to the peritoneum, so-called peritoneal metastases. In reality, the patient has iatrogenically suffered a secondary conflict with her peritoneum. The musculoskeletal system. The little animal finally needed a locomotor system with bones, tendons, cartilage and muscles. The cerebral medulla had to be added. Here is the seat of our self-value. If one breaks in the self-value, one reacts with the connective tissue. If one has a severe collapse in self-value, one reacts with the bone. A person with a healthy self-value, on the other hand, has an upright gait. Attention! With the cerebral medulla, we are now in the cerebrum. The cerebrum-controlled special programs make in the conflict active phase, not as before cell multiplication, but cell shrinkage. In connective tissue, this cell loss is called necrosis, in bone osteolysis. Due to the loss of bone marrow, the patient now has anemia in the conflict active phase. In the healing phase, blood is produced excessively, and leukemia is the result. At the end of the healing process, the blood count is normalized. With these special programs, nature does not help immediately. If the osteolysis become larger, the bone breaks. And in nature, one is then a prey animal and is eaten. With these special programs, this self-value collapse must be solved first. In the healing phase, these necroses and osteolysis are filled up again under painful swelling. At the end of the healing phase, the swelling goes down again, but the bone remains thicker than it was before, and that is for life. This is like a fracture. At the end of healing, the fracture remains thickened. A thicker bone is better than a thinner one. So here, the biological sense is only at the end of the healing phase, but there remains a lifelong increase in function. For this reason, Dr. Hummer called this group also deluxe group. Social behavior. Our youngest brain is the cerebral cortex. It is also the most complex brain. This is where social interaction is coordinated, and it involves separation conflicts and territorial area conflicts. The cerebral cortex controls the squamous epithelium, red group. The separation conflict. In nature, when the young is separated from the mother, it is certain death for the young. Dear mother, you will never see your young again. Forget it. In the active phase of a separation conflict, we have impaired short-term memory. Alzheimer's is many or severe separation conflicts. Where the most contact was associated from the mother to the child, her outer skin ulcerates. The skin begins to flake and becomes rough. Now the picture of dry neurodermatitis is present. It can be imagined as if a glue joint has been torn open. This does not hurt, because it is accompanied by sensory paralysis of the outer skin. This place is sensory numb. This numbness of the skin, along with her impaired short-term memory, helps the mother to more easily forget her child, to move on with her life. Mother Nature is merciful. If, contrary to expectations, the child can still find its way back to the mother, this mother no longer accepts her child. She has forgotten it. If the mother can resolve her separation conflict, the ulcers of the outer skin are replenished with swelling and inflammation. The skin reddens, is hot, itches, and hurts. Now, dermatologists speak of skin deterioration, which is a healing phase. Such resolved separation conflicts include eczema, blooming neurodermatitis, hives, etc. The loss of territory conflict. Mother Nature constructs the biologically natural hierarchy. That is, the alpha wolf and the beta wolf, via the territorial area conflicts. This natural hierarchy is understood by all animals, even across the species barrier. Based on their behavior, we humans can relatively easily recognize the alpha and the beta wolf in the wolf pack. The alpha carries the tail high, the beta may not. Likewise, the wolf can recognize the top deer in the deer pack, etc. In nature also always only the strongest may pass on his genes. We, humans, do this with our farm animals, still in such a way until today. In cattle breeding, only the strongest bull is allowed to climb on the cow. The farmer wants healthy and strong calves. In nature, the individual wolf is not capable of survival. He must organize himself in the pack, to be able to hunt successfully. For the pack to function, it needs a structure, a command. That behavior is similar within a company. A boss is needed, and many employees. This ranking Mother Nature grants on the basis of the conflicts and constellations. Now it's getting exciting. The classic territorial fight. The stronger one defeats the weaker one. The weaker one has lost his territory now. He has his Hummer focus on the territorial area, more precisely in the brain relay of the coronary arteries. In the whole territorial area, we also have the fixation. The territorial areas have several peculiarities. This one territorial loss conflict now closes the right male territorial area side. The left female territory area side is still open. With this one loss of territory conflict, the beta is now cerebrally neutered and female. The inferior now carries the tail down and no longer up. He is fixated on the alpha, fixated. Homosexuality has to do with such conflicts. He now loves this alpha, and he will go through thick and thin for him. What the alpha says is like the amen and the prayer, for the beta wolf. Here one also sees that we must learn to understand medicine biologically. A purely psychological approach would lead in the wrong direction. Psychologized, one would think the inferior would hate the alpha from now on. No. Mother Nature does it with love. If now the alpha says, "We get this dough," the beta says, "Sir, yes sir." But the territorial areas are also about reproduction, especially concerning the male. The females are apparently all supposed to have children, and all are supposed to have many children. But not every male. In the case of the inferior, the male territorial area has been closed by the one active Hummer focus, and he has become feminine as a result. However, this has also caused his libido to plummet. Now, when the female has her ovulation, the alpha is available. The alpha is the one who has no conflicts in the territory. The beta wolf, on the other hand, does not want to jump the female at all. Thus, the female has her children consistently from the alpha. In this territorial loss conflict, the squamous epithelium of the coronary arteries ulcerates, increasing their lumen cross-sectional area, and allowing more blood to reach the heart muscle. The heart becomes stronger. Thus, again in the active phase, the sense of this special program is to reach a function reinforcement, just by cell shrinkage. If the inferior in this territorial fight, despite this special program and the heart strengthened in the achievement, nevertheless does not manage to reconquer his territory, he resigns. He gives up and subordinates himself. Thus, he can transform the intensity of the conflict down, and he can grow old with it, without dying of emaciation. He has come to terms with his conflict and resigned himself to it. He thus remains in a so-called hanging active conflict course, and thereby continuously builds up conflict load. However, with his resignation, the male territorial area side closes itself to him, whereby he becomes female and gay. With us humans, such a resignation occurs after approximately 6 months. With a conflict load of more than 9 months, we would not solve this territorial conflict at all because we could not survive the crisis, the classic heart attack. But fortunately, we instinctively do not strive for conflict resolution. Through our change of nature, we prefer not to become alpha anymore. Regarding heart attack, it should be added that it is not the blocked coronary vessel in the healing phase that is to blame, as conventional medicine erroneously assumes. But rather the fact that during the crisis, no more signals are sent from the brain relay to the heart muscle, causing the heart to stop beating. The heart attack is, therefore, purely a brain symptom. Bypass surgery is not a causative therapy. Moreover, in the event of an actual occlusion, the coronary vessels themselves naturally form bypasses of blood vessels in a short time. A program of nature, which would be impossible, had one died of the occlusion. Fortunately, we humans instinctively solve such territorial losses, usually never again. Nowadays, a loss of territory conflict already occurs with a boy, because his mother leaves him. For example, because of a divorce. The boy is soft, already after 6 months, and gay fixated on the mother. The boy would have had to regain his basic trust in his mother, to solve this conflict, that this never happened. But it should have happened within 6 months. If his mother had sworn to him then never to leave him again, in that window of time, the boy could have resolved that conflict. He would have become a different man. But that did not happen. And the boy became a softie, who is edible fixated on the mother. He is either a bachelor or lives with an older mother substitute. He doesn't have much to do with women in general. Basically, he doesn't want to know anything about women. But, and here comes the most important thing, he can grow old with it and without any complaints. The severity of angina pectoris has also decreased with the resignation and transformation of the conflict. He has hardly any heart palpitations. However, if such a territorial loss conflict with the coronary arteries is resolved, with a conflict load of more than 9 months, an empirical value, the crisis is inevitably fatal. If you look at the ratio between the large number of softies nowadays and the minimal number of deaths from heart attacks, you will see that such a territory loss conflict is almost never resolved. Why is Mother Nature so strict about this special program? The reason for this might be, again, a biological reason. The answer will probably lie in the fact that it requires just one alpha so that a herd functions. Think of the rooster with his 20 hens. The alpha has no territorial conflicts. He is not manic-depressive or moody. He is fully mature and not developmentally stunted. And as a man, he can cope with several women simultaneously. He can feed their children, and there would be a lot of them. And should he once no longer be the best, poof. The better one is in his place. The rest of the men are allowed to do what they want. Mother Nature does not care about that anymore. But these beta wolves should also not reproduce, because they are not good enough for that, indeed. Ask such a softy today, whether he would like to start a family. He will confirm my remarks here. Unfortunately, that is so, nowadays. With these somewhat very detailed descriptions, I would like to refer to what is the on the one hand, somewhat complex, and on the other hand, highly interesting chapter of the psychosis. Everything that is called manic depressive takes place in these territorial areas, and even these psychotic conditions have a deeper biological meaning. Germanische Heilkunde is fascinating, and often I ask myself how Dr. Hummer was able to discover all this, single-handedly. Function failures. Last but not least, I would like to briefly introduce you to the fascinating functional failures. They are all controlled by the cerebral cortex. Their conflict-active phase is the functional failure, such as the loss of the sense of smell. None of these functional failures make cell proliferation or cell loss, which is why there can never be inflammation here in the healing phase. The loss of function is about nerves. And nerves no longer divide after birth. The biological sense of these function failures presents itself immediately in the conflict-active phase. Mother Nature helps, therefore, again immediately. With functional failure exactly as with a motor conflict of not being able to escape, with a paralysis of the leg musculature. And this is nothing else than the well-known playing dead reflex. What does the rabbit, which cannot escape, do? Correct. It plays dead. If one solves this conflict, then due to the edema storage in the motor cortex center, this paralysis becomes apparently worse. Nevertheless, however, the signals come through about half and half, and one has Parkinson's. Parkinson's disease would be a so-called hanging healing of a motor conflict. This edema in the brain relay gets bigger and bigger until the crisis, which is an epileptic seizure. Due to the constriction of the vessels in this crisis, which is always strongly sympathicotonic, the edema in the brain is squeezed out. From now on, all symptoms begin to disappear, until they are completely gone at the end of this healing. Multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, stroke, epilepsy, etc. are all different progressions of a motor conflict. This conflict must be found and resolved, and then the symptoms disappear. The common threads. If one knows the handedness, one also knows whether this conflict has to do with a partner or mother-child. If the patient is currently in the healing phase and has found the conflict and the solution for this conflict, then one can estimate the conflict load. And thus one knows how long this healing phase will last. So, you can take a look into the future. It is really fascinating. I promise you, if one day you were able to verify these biological laws for the first time on any given patient case, you would be astonished. You would have an aha experience. The 5 biological laws of nature. The 5 biological laws of nature, discovered by Dr. Hummer, are laws in the living. They explain the biological connections of all special programs in living individuals. Special programs, which were given to us by Mother Nature on our way through life. As if Mother Nature knew from experience, that such a moment of terror would happen to you. One can call this also the history of development, in which Mother Nature has adapted her creatures to the respective conditions optimally. Biological law of nature. None of these conflictive experiences was willed or self-induced by the individual. It always caught the individual unprepared and on the wrong foot. The individual was always on his own or felt isolated, and it was always highly acute or dramatic for the individual. So that years later, he can still remember this moment of shock very well. Like a photograph, the brain stores this moment of shock. The first biological law of nature discovered by Dr. Hummer is also called the iron rule of cancer. Iron because it applies to all special programs. The term cancer would have to be redefined. With Dr. Hummer, everything is cancer, which makes cell plus or cell minus in the conflict active phase. He calls the functional failures cancer equivalent disease, because they run completely the same. But in the conflict active phase, they have no cell change, just functional failure. In general, with Germanische Heilkunde, which will be the basis of every therapy in the future, many terms have to be redefined. So, also the term disease. Should the conflict active, mostly symptomless, and therefore mostly overlooked phase be called disease? In this conflict active phase, after all, the individual is stressed, and every fiber of his body is focused on conflict resolution. Or should we call the healing phase a disease? Here the cause of the illness has already been resolved, and the individual must recover from his exertion. Rather, the term disease would fit the conflict shock, because this biological conflict is the cause that such a special program has to start at all. In medicine, many things will have to be re-evaluated because of Dr. Hummer's discovery. One can definitely say, Dr. Hummer introduces a paradigm shift in medicine. Does the therapy have to revolve around the symptom or the cause? Of course, around the cause. The cause must be eliminated, only then do the symptoms disappear. With the biological conflict shock, the DHS, a special program starts now. Which, from the biological point of view, helps us to solve this conflict to regain balance, health. The special programs controlled from the brainstem and cerebellum make cell proliferation in the conflict active phase. The brainstem and the cerebellum together are called the old brain. The special programs controlled from the cerebral medulla and the cerebral cortex make cell loss in the conflict active phase. The cerebral medulla and the cerebral cortex together are called the cerebrum. Furthermore, the functional failures are also controlled from the cerebral cortex, making neither cell shrinkage nor cell proliferation. From this order alone, one already sees that a single, allegedly malignant cell does not exist at all. Rather, such an explanation arises from an inability to understand the true connections. By the way, without the brain, one cannot breed cancer at all. With the test animal during its torture, a biological conflict is always set, and it is held conflict active. Cruel. Fifth biological law of nature. Terms such as cancer, allergy, disease, inflammation, depression, etc., arouse fear, but until now, have remained completely misunderstood by medicine in their essence. The focus has always been on treating the respective symptom. The true cause is not understood. One does not deal with the psyche of the patient at all. And therefore, it is not surprising that conventional medicine achieves outstanding results in emergency medicine, but is absolutely incapable of dealing with those diseases that arise of their accord. This has remained unchanged since its 100-year existence to date. And here lies the domain of Germanische Heilkunde, which will one day incorporate emergency medicine as complementary medicine. The Germanische Heilkunde has recognized that the diseases are a symptom either from the active phase or from the healing phase. From the point of understanding the history of development, all of them are only part of a sensible biological special program. The active phase helps to solve the cause, the healing phase helps to clean up the garbage needed for this. With the vast majority of special programs, the meaning lies immediately in the active phase. In other words, our body itself has built in the cure for the cause. For example, the mama CA in the mother is the therapy of her sick child. If the child becomes healthy through the increased breast milk, the mother can solve her care conflict for her sick child, and her breast cancer disappears spontaneously. With this new understanding, from now on, therapy is about avoiding the cause. Emergency medicine should remain for emergencies. Otherwise, however, no stone will be left unturned. With this fifth biological law of nature also, the patient understands that the symptom in his body is not the real problem. Why should he be afraid of an event that helps him to solve the cause of his problem? He understands that the real problem exists in his company or elsewhere. He will act causally on his own, and actively solve the cause of his cancer. Not only that, but he loses the completely unfounded fear that something foreign is raging in his body and supposedly wants to eat him up. By understanding this fifth biological law of nature, one loses the fear of the symptom. The Germanische Heilkunde makes us free. Second biological law of nature. If the first biological law of nature describes the cause, then the second biological law of nature describes the solution. These first two laws of nature, discovered by Dr. Hummer, are also the most important. The other three laws of nature are more descriptive in nature. The second law of nature is the law of two-phase of all special programs, provided that the conflict could be solved. Thus, one gets from the first sympathicotonic conflict active phase to the second vagatonic healing phase only thanks to conflict resolution. If this conflict cannot be resolved, then the first sympathicotonic stress phase continues. If the conflict is not resolved, without conflict resolution, the course of the conflict would look as follows. You have a patient in front of you, who only has the active symptoms of the respective special program. Any colon cancer would become larger and larger. The mama CA or the melanoma would also become larger and larger. In the case of bone, osteolysis occurs during the conflict active phase. So, if the patient has a self-value conflict active and not resolved, he would be diagnosed with osteoporosis in conventional medicine. Now, of course, it also depends on how heavy this conflict weighs on the patient's soul. He is now in a state of constant stress. Does not eat, hardly sleeps at all, hardly finds any rest, and is draining his energy reserves. It is foreseeable that his battery will be exhausted at some point, and he will die of emaciation. Mother Nature constructs the beta wolves via territorial conflicts. The pack needs many beta wolves, and they must not die. They arrange themselves with their conflict, give up opposite the stronger one, subordinate themselves, come to terms with it and transform the conflict intensity down. And become old with it. But they are permanently changed in their essence, for example soft. If the conflict cannot be solved, one possibility is death by emaciation. The other possibility would be to come to terms with the conflict resulting in a chronic symptom of the active phase. For example, MS, diabetes, or psychosis. So, how does one resolve conflict? As already indicated, there can be no patent solution. But a conflict is resolved when it can no longer happen. For example, when the person with whom you had this conflict dies. The death of one person can therefore mean life for the other. However, the conflict can also no longer happen if one consistently avoids it, for example, by giving notice and avoiding the boss forever. But a conflict can also be solved by a clarifying conversation with the boss, and possibly even lead to a lasting friendship. You can also solve a conflict by changing your inner attitude towards it. For example, if your grandfather forced you to drink milk when you were a child, and you have since suffered from a chronic milk allergy, this milk allergy can disappear if you say to yourself, "I was a child then, and I was powerless against my grandfather. Today, I am an adult and no longer let anyone force me to do anything." Or, the enemy of the good is the better. If you have been abandoned by your partner and suffered a conflict in the process, you can resolve this conflict by seeking a better partner. If one can finally laugh about this conflict, this laughter is an unmistakable sign that this conflict is really solved. And conversely, if the person bursts into tears when talking about it, it is an unmistakable sign that the conflict has not been resolved. By the way, the royal art in Germanische Heilkunde is to give wise advice to the patient. However, wisdom cannot be learned. The alpha people, men and women, are wise people, because they have no territorial conflicts and therefore could reach their full emotional maturity. The crisis in the middle of the healing phase. With conflict resolution, the patient visibly falls into deep vagatonia. The vessels change from narrow to wide, and he gets warm hands up to fever. In the brain and on the organ level, edema is deposited in the involved areas. The patient is in the so-called exudative phase. This edema storage causes swelling, which in turn causes various symptoms, such as intracranial pressure and pain. The patient visibly feels sicker. Now the patients run to various therapists. One therapist administers antibiotics, the other globules. At the end of the healing phase, the patient is well, and one therapist attributes it to the antibiotics, the other to the globules. From the perspective of Germanische Heilkunde, both therapists have tried to cure a healing phase. And to stop this falling into vagatonia, Mother Nature has built in the crisis. The crises are similar depending on the cotyledon. Actually, crises are brain symptoms. There are the brainstem crisis, cerebellum crisis, cerebral medulla crisis, and cerebral cortex crisis. All crises are sympathicotonic with constriction of vessels, cold extremities, and cold sweat. The patient in the crisis is freezing. He is freezing and feels cold. Depending on the load of the conflict, this crisis can be a second spike, which does not always have to be noticed. However, it can also last for several days with pre, main and post-crisis. The most impressive crises are those of the cerebral cortex. Here, in addition to the symptoms already described, we have the absence, migraine, hepatic coma, pulmonary embolism, myocardial infarction, epileptic seizure, and so on. All patients experience the crisis itself. The critical point, especially with large loads of conflict, is always after the crisis. The crisis has the task to steer the rudder quasi back towards health, and therefore one must not suppress a sympathicotonic crisis with vagatonic substances. On the contrary, one must strengthen the crisis, for example, with coffee. If the crisis was too weak or the conflict load was too big, the patient falls to death after the crisis. If the crisis was strong enough, the patient manages to find his way back to eutony, health, after the crisis. At this point, the former doctors declared, the patient is now out of the woods. So, the crisis is this critical mountain. With the conflict resolution, therefore, the patient feels worse and worse, because of the edema buildup. In the crisis, the patients think that their body is going crazy, or even having to die. With the onset of the crisis, the edema is squeezed out, and the patient has a urinary flood phase. He has to go to the toilet remarkably often. After the crisis, the brain relay and the organ area begin to scar. Now the patient is in the restitutive phase. From now on, things get better and better. At the end of the healing phase, the patient is almost like new. The microbes have degraded the tumors, the holes have been refilled. The functional deficits have disappeared. Only scars remain in the brain and at the organ level, but these are usually no longer a problem. The patient is healthy again. A small example of a crisis you may have experienced yourself. After a resolved territorial trouble, concerning the squamous epithelium of the small curvature of the stomach pain is immediately gone, but one feels nauseous. This nausea culminates in the crisis, namely in an absence, squamous epithelium, and an epileptic seizure of the striated muscular components of the small curvature of the stomach. One has to vomit, is centralized and ice cold. After that, one falls back into vagatonia. One gets warm hands again, and nausea dissipates. So, this vomiting was a crisis. What has been described so far is one task of the crisis, to steer the rudder back in the direction of health. The other task of the crisis is to see if the conflict can be resolved in a reasonable time. If one has taken too long, one dies shortly after the crisis. I want to explain this drastic selection of Mother Nature, based on the heart attack. Let us take the territorial fight of deer. The weaker one is driven away by the stronger deer. The weaker one thereby suffers a loss of territory conflict. It cannot solve this conflict, remains conflict active, and visibly builds up conflict load. Now, if the wolf tears the top deer, the so far inferior deer thinks, that meets favorably. I can take over the herd again. With this, he solves his loss of territory conflict and enters the healing phase, and the crisis. Now, Mother Nature checks the conflict load built up so far. If this has exceeded a critical limit, with us humans it would be 9 months, for the loss of territory conflict, an empirical value. Mother Nature says meaningfully, you have needed too long for this. You are not the best to resume the right for your reproduction. And before you continue to cause trouble in the pack, I will let you die. So similarly, one must imagine the selection of Mother Nature. Now, however, there is also the erroneous conflict solution. Let's assume that the employee suffered a loss of territory conflict in the company due to his demotion. He is active in the conflict and loses weight. After 6 months, he comes to terms with the situation by saying to himself, I'll put in the few years it takes to retire. I certainly won't make any more effort for this stupid company. Thus, he can transform his conflict down, and also the angina pectoris decreases. Now, with retirement, a new life begins for this former employee. The problems at the company are a thing of the past, and now he can finally devote himself to his hobby, his aviary. There he can appoint himself president and soon governor general. Now, this freshly retired man suddenly has his territory, thus solving his loss of territory, which was active for well over 9 months, and about 6 weeks after retirement, he dies of a heart attack. Our Minister of Social Affairs would call this happening socially acceptable early death. Erroneously, this conflict solution was, therefore, because, in nature, retirement does not exist. In the natural pack, this fellow or this beta wolf would have remained forever, and could have become old with it. In Germanische Heilkunde, we could have advised this coworker already after the conflict, watch out with the pension. Instead, do not go into the pension. Stay in the company as a night porter, for example. Maybe even without pay, so that you annoy yourself every day anew, and thus do not solve this loss of territory conflict. You get nothing out of retirement. This example should show that it is not always about conflict resolution. Often the therapy is called, so that the affected person can survive it. Remain conflict active. Fourth biological law of nature. Watch a toddler as he crawls through the garden. The child puts pretty much everything in his mouth, and that's a good thing. The child makes acquaintance with the microbes and will later have them available for any healing phases. However, if the child is not allowed to put anything in its mouth, it will not be able to get acquainted with microbes. The adult no longer puts all kinds of things into his mouth. Its eventual healing phases will be non-biological, as a result. We need the microbes as surgeons. For example, no surgeon can remove a prostate CA without damaging the nerves, which in turn results in permanent impotence. The microbes, on the other hand, can tuberculate an inactive prostate CA without damaging the nerves. All microbes strictly adhere to tissue boundaries and would never affect another germ layer. Thus, the nerve fibers remain unaffected in a biological healing phase with tuberculosis. In the previous conflict active phase, tumors developed in the old brain-controlled organs, which help resolve the triggering conflict by cell proliferation and functional enhancement. Now in the healing phase, the conflict is resolved, and this tumor is unnecessary. It also no longer has cell division and is inactive. With the resolution of the conflict, the microbes now receive the command from the brain to begin their work, as garbage men and surgeons, and break down this tumor, which has become superfluous, in a tuberculous, caseous, necrotizing manner. The tumor decays similarly to an apple that rots. So, during this old brain-controlled healing phase, tuberculous decomposition always occurs, and a typical symptom is night sweats. So if you know the sweaty night sweats, then it is always a double reason to rejoice. First, you could solve your conflict. Second, you own the microbes. In such a tuberculous healing phase, the body loses a lot of protein, which must be returned to the body via a high-protein diet. Holding a fasting cure in such a healing phase, in order to starve this supposedly malignant cancer, can rapidly cost the patient his life. He wears himself out and dies of exhaustion. At the turn of the last century, pulmonary tuberculosis, a relieved fear of death, was widespread and also had the nickname consumption or also poor people's disease. The rich, who could afford a high-protein diet, usually survived this consumption. The poor, however, who hardly came to meat, died like flies. Every mother is also happy when her sick child eats with an appetite. No mother would refuse food to her sick child. So, in the case of the brainstem-controlled glandular tissue in the healing phase, as associated microbes, we have the fungi and the fungal bacteria, or mycobacteria. In the case of the cerebellum-controlled glandular tissue, the associated microbes are fungal bacteria. In the case of the medulla-controlled connective tissue, the associated microbes are bacteria. The bacteria help to replenish the necroses and osteolysis of the previous conflict active phase. Borrelia are bacteria. The typical symptoms of Lyme disease are joint pain. Joint pain occurs in the healing phase, after a resolved self-devaluation conflict. The bacteria are now at work in such a healing phase, but these bacteria did not cause this healing phase. They have been called only like the fire department with fire, from our body to help. Antibiotic administration in such a healing phase, with its sympathicotonic effect, causes the patient to be lifted from vagatonia. The swelling goes down, and with it, the pain. However, the microbes stop working because they work exclusively in the vagatonia. The healing phase proceeds despite the administration of antibiotics, but non-biologically. The necroses and defects remain for life. The squamous epithelium works completely without microbes, because the viruses almost certainly do not exist. The virus is a hypothesis of Louis Pasteur, who examined sick people. He found a group of patients in whom the fungi were working, and a group of patients in whom the bacteria were working. Pasteur's opinion was, the microbe makes you sick. But then Pasteur had a group of patients in front of him, where he could not find any microbe. These were patients from the red squamous cell group. The patients had pneumonia, cystitis, hepatitis, polio, fever blister, rhinitis, etc. Then Pasteur thought, in these patients the cause would have to be a microbe, which on the one hand was so small that he could not see it with his light microscope, but on the other hand was so toxic that it could cause hepatitis, for example. And to this unseen microbe, Pasteur gave the name virus, which in Latin means poison. Pasteur's thoughts that microbes make people ill, and that there is a virus, are still held by conventional medicine today. Robert Koch formulated pathogen detection in his Koch's postulates. First, detection and isolation of the pathogen from the diseased tissue. Second, cultivation of the pathogen in a pure culture. Third, excitation of the same disease in a healthy person. Fourth, re-isolation of the pathogen. It is generally thought today that the virus has a size of a few atoms and can latch onto the cell's DNA as a molecule. By dividing the cell, the virus would automatically copy itself along with the cell, and thus reproduce. The virus is not supposed to be alive and therefore has no metabolism. Due to its molecular size, Koch's first postulate can hardly be fulfilled in the case of the virus. If one compares the cell with a pile of sand, the virus is a grain of sand. This problem does not exist with fungi and bacteria. These microbes are alive, have metabolism, and are easily detected by light microscope, because of their size. So, in a pulmonary tuberculosis patient or a Lyme disease patient, one can easily detect the respective microbes. The cultivation of a fungus or a bacterium is also successful. Fungi can be grown in a cold, moist, that is sympathicotonic, environment. Fungi also multiply in the conflict active phase. Bacteria can be grown in a warm, vagatonic, environment, such as in an incubator. Bacteria reproduce only with conflict resolution in vagatonia. But how would one like to grow this grain of sand virus in pure culture, which always needs the entire pile of sand for its reproduction? For this, conventional medicine has to devise a trick, see PCR test. But what is an absolute absurdity, according to the fourth biological law of nature of Dr. Hummer, is the fulfillment of Koch's third postulate. Namely, a microbe cannot trigger a vagatonic healing phase. Therefore, it is not possible to trigger Lyme disease in a healthy person, again with a Borrelia of a Lyme disease patient. One cannot trigger pulmonary tuberculosis with a tubercle of a pulmonary tuberculosis patient in a healthy person. The microbe is no more the cause of a healing phase, than the fireman is not the cause of the fire. Koch's third postulate can never have been fulfilled. For this reason, there can also be no contagion. However, many people can be at the same time in a healing phase, for example, with pulmonary tuberculosis after a war. During the war, these people suffered a fear of death, which they could have solved by the now peace. In all these pulmonary tuberculosis patients, the tubercles can be detected. But this proof does not mean that these tubercles are the cause. Let us assume that Dr. Hummer is right in his assertions that the evil in our body does not exist, that the infection does not exist, that the carcinogenic substances do not exist. Isn't that liberating? We would lose these unfounded fears and could march through life with relief. We could recognize this current corona hype for what it is, namely the biggest robbery of freedom from the world population, and the installation of a global hierarchical world dictatorship, thus the enslavement of mankind. Perhaps this is also the reason why Dr. Hummer has been fought and hushed up by the deep state for 4 decades. The tract equals allergy. Everything that runs chronically runs via tracts. In the moment of shock, the affected person tears open his eyes, ears, and mouth. At this moment, our brain makes a snap like a camera. The Hummer focus is created. At the same moment, our brain stores all possible sensory impressions, to warn us in times of similar situations in the future. The sensory impressions include the smells, sounds, tastes, sensations, the temperature, the sun, conflicting situations, conflicting places, etc., and of course also perceived individuals, such as certain people or animals, and of course grasses, pollen, etc. So, everything that we perceive can be stored by our brain. Here in Germanische Heilkunde, we speak of tracts. This also refers to the common term, allergy. If one was drinking milk during the conflict, our brain could store this milk as a tract, resulting in the so-called milk allergy. Example. The toddler one day got to drink the strange milk instead of the mother's breast. For the organism of the toddler, this was shocking, and his brain associated an indigestible morsel with the intestine. In this biological conflict, the milk was stored as a tract. The sensible biological special program of the intestinal villi now immediately starts a cell multiplication of the intestinal villi, to be able to digest this indigestible morsel milk nevertheless, with increased secretion, functional reinforcement. In the process, the smooth intestinal musculature is put to rest at the same place on the intestine, which is also called constipation. Suppose this indigestible milk could be successfully digested. In that case, the cell proliferation of the intestinal villi, which is no longer needed, is now tuberculated on the one hand. On the other hand, the smooth intestinal musculature is put into increased peristalsis, also called diarrhea. At the end of the healing phase, everything is good again. But the brain of the toddler has memorized this milk as a tract. In the future, if milk, even if only in traces, should be realized by the intestine, this SBS immediately starts again, without the need of another shock moment. This person is not even consciously aware of these traces of milk in the food. But the subconscious reacts instantly. As of now, this toddler is allergic to milk with his gut. Tracts can remain for a lifetime. Even as an adult, this person can maintain the so-called lactose intolerance. But the term milk allergy is imprecise. Suppose one has reacted with this conflict with the milk, instead of with a morsel conflict concerning the intestine, with a separation conflict concerning the outer skin. In that case, one reacts to milk likewise allergically, but not with the intestine, but even with the outer skin. If someone says he has a milk allergy, then one must immediately ask, which symptom he reacts to milk. Because from the organ symptom, we can conclude the content of the conflict. The milk was only stored as a track. No matter what this allergy is called, the mechanism is always the same. In the same way, one could react to smoke with a migraine, if smoke was stored as a track in the case of a frontal fear, a danger that comes at you from the front. A migraine is the crisis after a frontal fear. The so-called weekend migraine extended would mean that one always gets off the track into the healing phase on the weekend. So, a track must keep this frontal fear conflict active during the week. It is almost obvious that the suffered frontal fear is then to be sought in the company. With the knowledge of Germanische Heilkunde, one quickly becomes a detective, and it is thieving fun when one finds something. Everything that is commonly called chronic disease also proceeds according to this mechanism. Diabetes is caused by a conflict of resistance. Resistance against what? Diabetes is a conflict-active symptom. If this diabetes remains chronic, it means nothing else than that one is permanently on the track. This track can also be the life partner, if the life partner has played a role in this conflict. Now, of course, one might be tempted to ask, why Mother Nature allows her individuals to be chronically ill with these tracks? What is supposed to make sense with this torment? The track itself is only a kind of early warning system, similar to a radar system. It causes, again subconsciously, we are after all with the subconscious nervous system, and it happens therefore completely away from the conscious mind, immediately a relapse with sympathetic atonia. Animals notice this stress and thus avoid the track. A dog that a certain person has kicked in a confrontational manner remembers this person, and avoids him. On the other hand, we humans who have been kicked by the boss in the company also notice this, but we continue to return to this company, and thus remain chronically ill. So, it is not the nonsensical track, but our society that is non-biological. We cannot change Mother Nature, but we can change our society. Every chronic ailment, no matter what you call it, works like the allergy. This consideration is perhaps only that we have never understood under the term allergy that we can also allergically react against the partner or against driving a car. So, to the DHS, the associated tracks must always be found as well. The track is part of the conflict. It belongs to the conflict. As long as this conflict remains unresolved, so long too, do the tracks work. So, if you cannot solve the conflict, you can still become healthy by avoiding this track. And for this, one has every right in the world. The goose has a right to avoid the fox. Even if the fox says, "Dear goose, you are discriminating against me." Finally, on the topic of tracks, I would like to give you some more important information to keep on hand. As mentioned, the track belongs to the conflict. If this conflict is solved now, the track dissolves with it and the allergy or chronic suffering disappears immediately. That is also biological. If this conflict is no longer a conflict, then there need be no further warnings about it, right? A 40-year-old seminar participant told us that she had had a severe sun allergy since she was 5 years old, with various severe symptoms such as migraine, outer skin, stomach, etc. Twice she ended up in the intensive care clinic because her body overreacted so badly. The strange thing is that she does not suffer from the winter sun. On the glacier, she can bake in the sun. But as soon as the outside temperature is above 25 degrees Celsius and the sun is beating down, she overreacts. Her conflict, where the sun and 25 degrees outside temperature stored as track, was quickly found. At the Markusplatz, she became lost to her parents, when she was 5 years old. For the child, this was a single catastrophe. She suffered several conflicts, like frontal fear by the initiated police operation, separation from the parents, territorial trouble by losing the parents, etc. I said to the now 45-year-old, that this conflict could never happen again today. If she lost her parents today at the Markusplatz, she would sit down nevertheless in the next coffee house, light a cigarette and make a few telephone calls with her cell phone. I said to her that by recognizing her conflict, it had come out of her subconscious into her consciousness. And she has now recognized that this conflict from childhood is irrelevant for her today. She no longer has an allergy to the sun. Indeed, since this conflict resolution at the seminar, her sun allergy is gone. Based on this testimonial, one can easily understand this mechanism. The track warns us, just like the stove top warns us, on which one once carelessly reached and burned oneself. In the future, we will be more careful with this hot plate, and we will keep this caution for the rest of our lives. But when that hot plate no longer exists, there is no need to be careful about it. Based on this experience report, something else to clarify. If she could avoid the sun, she was healthy. Does that count as therapy or not? And how that is valid? Although her conflict was not really solved, she was healthy. Her conflict was triggered by the track sun plus 25 degrees Celsius. This track was stored in her mind as a child. If she came on this track, her body literally screamed, the way she did as a child. By becoming aware of her childhood conflict, which she could still remember fiercely, today with her 45 years, she could see the difference. At that time, as a child, it was a catastrophe for her. Today it would be an oops and not worth mentioning. Her subconsciousness has been able to recognize that sun plus 25 degrees Celsius is no longer dangerous. We like to repress our conflicts completely into the subconscious, and often cannot remember them with the best will in the world. The Germanische Heilkunde helps, with the right questioning, which always starts from the organ symptom, the body cannot lie, to find this today's repressed conflict. All this is in the scientific diagnosis chart of Dr. Hummer, and this can be learned. Over time, you gain experience and can really become a people whisperer. I would like to know how many people are chronically ill, for whom the cause of their suffering is now irrelevant. If the knowledge of Germanische Heilkunde would be part of general education, we would undoubtedly have fewer chronically ill people. Different courses of conflict over tracks. Via the tracks, one gets into the various conflict courses and thus remains chronically ill. By the way, these sensible biological special programs are made for one run and not for hundreds. So, it makes biological sense to avoid the tracks and nonsensical not to avoid them. Think of the hot stove top. Once you can be careless and touch it, but if you touch the hot stove top hundreds of times, you can imagine what will happen. In the old brain-controlled special programs, we have tuberculous degradation in the healing phase. This degradation of the tumor may well overshoot somewhat, and more tissue may be degraded than was grown in the conflict active phase. Let us assume that 1,000 cells were grown in the active phase, then 1,100 cells may well be degraded in the healing phase. In the end, you have 100 cells less than the original tissue. 100 cells less is not worth mentioning at all and does absolutely nothing. But if you go through this program hundreds of times, the initial tissue can literally melt away. This results, for example, in hypothyroidism, prostatic secretion drying up, mucoviscidosis, sagging breasts, etc. It is the other way around with connective tissue. Here at the end of the healing phase, the tissue is thicker than before, which is also the biological sense. Suppose one starts these special programs hundreds of times over a track, and brings them again into solution. In that case, the initial tissue becomes thicker and thicker, which leads to growths of the connective tissue. For example, cellulitis, scar tissue, or lipedema. Now, when does one or more tracks occur, and when does it not? Let's compare our brain with a computer. You may be familiar with the Task Manager app on the computer. This Task Manager graphically shows the computer's performance for each individual application that is currently running. If you start too many applications simultaneously, the computer power is exhausted, and the computer becomes very slow. Then you have to close a few applications that are running unnecessarily, and the computer immediately becomes faster. Let's assume that we are sitting in a room where there are no exciting sensory impressions. Our brain is not particularly busy. Figuratively speaking, the computer performance of the brain is bobbing along at the bottom. If a DHS happens, our brain makes a click. But since there are no special sensory impressions, it cannot store anything, and therefore there is no track to this conflict. If one bites into the apple, however, then one needs a certain brain's computing power for this. One must first examine the apple. Then one must get the teeth into this apple. Then a taste sensation of sweet-sour takes place. Our brain is almost 100% occupied with this apple. If a DHS now occurs, then our brain stores this apple as a track, and from now on, one reacts to this apple with a recurrence of the original conflict. As already mentioned, no new DHS, highly acute dramatic, isolative felt, caught on the wrong foot, is necessary for this recurrence. One reacts allergically to this apple from now on. If one has thereby suffered a separation conflict with the outer skin, one reacts allergically to this apple with the outer skin. If one has thereby suffered trouble with the intestine, one reacts to this apple allergically with the intestine. The biological sense is to solve this conflict. That is the program of Mother Nature that runs with us in the subconscious. The exact same can happen with the milk. We, humans, are a very rare mammalian species, which drink foreign milk as adults. To be able to utilize this milk by our organism, proper brain performance is required. For example, very specific enzymes have to be formed to break down this milk. So, when we drink milk, this milk is present in our brain. If a conflict occurs, the brain stores the milk as a track. If one has reacted with a separation conflict, one reacts to milk allergically with the outer skin from now on. If one has reacted with an anger conflict, one reacts to milk allergically with the intestine from now on. You already see that the message, "I have a gluten intolerance," leaves a Germanic healer unsatisfied, and he will immediately ask, with which symptom, are you allergic? In conflict, there does not have to be a track. But it can come to one or even more tracks. We speak of primary and secondary tracks. The main track is always the conflict itself, for example, the breakup or the anger. The secondary track would be the apple or the milk. An example to show you that colorectal cancer, ulcerative colitis, constipation, diarrhea, etc., always start with an anger conflict, but due to the different track-related conflict courses, it comes to these different intestinal symptoms. Let's construct an annoyance conflict with the neighbor. One was accused of something by him in an unjustified way. The Hummer focus is on the brainstem on the left. It is, therefore, a morsel of excrement that one cannot get rid of, involved in the large intestine, in the active phase, the intestinal villi, glandular tissue, which are broken down tuberculously in the healing phase. In the active phase, there is constipation, and in the healing phase, diarrhea. Constipation and diarrhea is caused by the intestinal smooth muscle, midbrain, which always runs synchronously during such a morsel conflict. Strictly speaking, the smooth intestinal muscles make cell proliferation during the active phase, which is not degraded at all in the healing phase. However, this would lead into too much detail and is not so relevant for the following. On Dr. Hummer's scientific diagnosis chart, everything is written in detail. So, this anger conflict with the neighbor happens, which now itself plays an essential role as a potential track in this anger conflict and is therefore present in the brain. The neighbor has been in the head. With him, and only with him, one had this trouble. Now, with the conflict, one builds up conflict load. Immediately, one will not notice the cell proliferation and the clogging. But one is fully active in conflict with cold hands. One tries to solve this problem and talks to one's life partner about this impossible neighbor. The life partner can help you to perceive that this neighbor is basically mentally inferior. That solves this conflict for you, because you could change your point of view. This neighbor is actually to be pitied. Now, you enter the healing phase. The decisive question from what has been described so far is almost self-evident. How long did it take to resolve this conflict? Did it take 1 year? Then one has been conflict active for 1 year and has built up a conflict load of 1 year. A cell division of the intestinal villi over the period of 1 year? This tumor would have already been noticed for mechanical reasons alone. In addition, one would have had hardly any appetite for a year and would have been noticeably emaciated. Depending on the intensity of this conflict, one might have already died of emaciation. The fact that one has physically managed this year so far indicates a less intense conflict. One was thus so far merely hanging active. However, now has a year conflict load. This can cause considerable problems in the subsequent healing process, where a surgeon may have to intervene. In this case, we would need emergency medicine. Or would we only need a few hours, or perhaps only a few minutes? We would have had an hour of blockage and cell proliferation. How big is a tumor that has had 1 hour of cell division? Apple-sized or as big as the head of a pin? Probably the latter size dimension. I deny that one could observe a tumor growing with the naked eye. But let's let this colon cancer be the size of a pinhead. In the following healing phase of 1 hour, this tumor is tuberculously degraded by the microbes. After 1 hour, one would be completely healthy again. One had constipation for 1 hour and diarrhea for 1 hour. Done. Let's assume that this conflict remains active and that for a lifetime via the neighbor track. This would be possible, for example, if this neighbor were to move into his own living room as an asylum seeker. This would lead to a permanent track. Then the cell proliferation and the blockage would remain. After 1 year, one would have a colon cancer diagnosis at the latest, or would have died earlier from cachexia. With the following, the working mechanism of the track becomes even more clear. This neighbor should now be the neighbor of our weekend house in the country. Only on the weekends one gets to see this neighbor and thus to the track. If one lives in the city apartment during the week, one has come down from the track neighbor. The demands of everyday life also distract us. The single cycle course would occur if the conflict with the neighbor were definitively resolved, for example, by the clarifying conversation with the life partner. Then also, the neighbor track would dissolve. One would have had this SBS of the colon running once. According to the conflict load, the healing phase would have proceeded. At the end of the healing phase, one would be completely healthy again and would also remain healthy. One got over this inferior neighbor, and he could now talk about what he wants. It does not touch one anymore. But if you cannot solve this conflict, it helps to avoid this track. The goose can't solve the conflict with the fox either, but it can avoid it and thus stay healthy and alive. A polycyclic course can now occur as follows. During the week you are in the city house and only on weekends do you live in the country house. There you are active with your intestines for 2 days due to the neighbor track and have constipation. Back in the townhouse and away from the track neighbor, one comes into the healing phase with diarrhea for 2 days. For the remaining 3 days, one is entirely symptom-free. But one has to deal chronically with the intestine. With a bit of luck, the conventional physician would perhaps diagnose incipient Crohn's disease. However, if you give up your city house because of the pension, and move to the country house, then the neighbor track on the intestine causes hanging healing. The short recurrences in between are triggered by the neighbor track, which you now see several times every day. The intestine no longer calms down at all, and the conventional medical diagnosis of ulcerative colitis is established. So, you see, dear student, that colon cancer, colitis, constipation, diarrhea etc., all have a single cause and run chronically via tracks. In principle, all chronic courses of disease, no matter what they are called, follow the same pattern. So, it is also essential to find the corresponding tracks to the respective conflict. After all, one still has the possibility to evade, like the goose evades the fox. One gives up the country residence and moves away from the neighbor into the city, and becomes healthy. In Germanische Heilkunde, only the patient's understanding stands between the patient and his health. If the patient understands the connections, he is freed from the superstition and dogmatic thinking of scientifically disproved conventional medicine. He changes the direction of his steps on his own. He does it out of his interest to stay healthy. Likewise, he follows the laws of creation. Health is the will of creation. A creation whose child is the patient. The biological handedness. The biological handedness can differ from the previously believed. Many people recognize their real handedness only by the so-called clapping test, and often with an aha effect. The first action of the therapist, when the patient comes to see him, is to shake hands with you. You shake hands politely without a corona glove. Besides, with handshaking, one has already the first diagnosis. If the patient has ice-cold hands, one knows that he is conflict active with some special program. If he has boiling hot hands, one knows that he is in the healing phase with some special program. If he has normal warm hands, the supposed patient comes in another matter. The second thing the therapist does is to have the patient clap his hands, to determine his biological handedness and thus his partner side and his mother-child side. More about this in a moment. The third action of the therapist would be to find out the hormonal status of the patient. That is, to determine whether the patient is female or male. The hormonal situation plays an essential role in the territorial area. It is also not something fixed and can change. In time, and as we age, a female will then become more masculine, thus a male. And a male will then become more feminine, thus a female. Thus, with a change in hormones, nature and sensation have changed. Old conflicts can be resolved, because they can no longer be felt. New conflicts can arise, which did not play a role at all before. Old conflicts can be re-perceived, and the Hummer focus jumps from one side of the territory precisely to the opposite side. Thereby, the one SBS goes into solution, and the one exactly opposite in the brain is restarted. The territorial area of the cerebral cortex is, as said, the most complex part of the brain. How much people's behavior changes when their hormones change, you know yourself from personal experience. The young couple. The male man goes in front and protects his wife. The female woman walks behind the man at a respectable distance and lets herself be protected. The couple is harmonious. At the age of 50, the woman comes into menopause. The estrogen of her ovaries decreases, she loses her ovulation, and her period bleeding. In the brain, she switches her female territorial area with the male territorial area, and thus has male territorial behavior. The male is still male. Now, suddenly, two territorial deer live in the same territorial household. Now the sparks fly in the partnership. Now, they want to go through the same door at the same time. This almost unbearable state lasts 25 years until the man with his 75 years now also comes into the change. In the brain, he changes his male territorial area with the female one. From now on, the grandma goes in front, and the grandpa follows behind. Now it harmonizes again, so half and half. You have already observed all this yourself, and therefore you know that a female cannot be compared with an older grandma in her perceptions. They are almost different people and have a wholly different sense of conflict, although Mrs. Mullah officially remains Mrs. Mullah. However, a change in the hormonal situation also happens to the young woman, when she takes the pill. The pill masculinizes the woman. Male women also have no desire to have children. Who chooses the partner? The man, the woman, or vice versa? Correct. The woman chooses her partner. In your partnership, that was probably also the case. And the woman taking the pill is a male woman who likes softies. Since almost all women are on the pill these days, softies are in high demand. Alpha males are relatively less in demand. Biological handedness, on the other hand, is something fixed that can never change in a lifetime. It is determined at the first cell division of the fertilized egg cell, thus right at the beginning of our life. That the determination of the biological handedness happens at the first cell division is known from the identical twins. In the case of monozygotic cells, the first two cells start cell division all over again after the first cell division. After all, two children are created. These twins are genetically identical. But one claps on the right and the other on the left. The handedness can be recognized in the so-called clapping test by the fact that the more moved hand belongs quasi to the partner and the calmer hand belongs to the mother or child. The biological right-handed person claps with the right hand into the left hand. His right side of the body is the partner side, and his left side is the mother-child side. As already mentioned, handedness did not play a role in the brainstem. The handedness plays a role only starting from the cerebellum, extending then over the cerebral medulla into the cerebral cortex. But this also means that already at the first cell division, the cerebellum is at least created. Fascinating if one looks at this from the history of development. With the cerebellum, the first social behavior is programmed in. And from now on, a distinction is made between partner and mother-child. In nature, the relationship of mother-child is always clear. The mother recognizes her child among hundreds. And also, the child recognizes its mother. With the father, the child is not so sure, and also the father is somewhat uncertain towards 100 children, which is now his and which is not his. That is also the reason why the father goes on the partner's side. He is also not so relevant. On the other hand, the other half of our body belongs to the biological mother or later to the biological child. Partners are all those with whom we have to deal, such as friends, workmates, opponents, and so on. Mostly people from the same generation. The mother is one generation older. The biological child is one generation younger. If one suffers a motor conflict of not being able to hold on, one can paralysis the hand muscles. If it is about the partner's hand is paralyzed. With the right-hander right and with the left-hander left. On the other hand, if one could not hold the mother or child, the mother-child's hand is paralyzed. The right-handed person's hand is paralyzed on the left, and a left-handed person's hand is paralyzed on the right. The same principle applies to connective tissue and bones, ovaries and testicles, external skin, etc. If one was retrained as a child as a biological left-handed person on the right side, this does not change the biological left-handedness. The partner side is and remains on the left side. Even by a hormonal change, one does not change his handedness. The handedness, therefore, remains fixed for life. Final note. Dr. Hummer often called his discovery a gift of the gods. With the tragic death of his son, germanische Heilkunde became known worldwide through the case of our daughter Olivia, who was suffering from cancer. The brutal fates of two innocent children intertwined the three Norns at the foot of Yggdrasil with the global paradigm shift in medicine, automatically freeing medicine from the hands of the deep state. Germanische Heilkunde, with its 5 biological laws of nature, will be the basis of our future medicine, worldwide. This new medicine is strictly scientific and does not need dogmas, nor does it need any statistics. And despite its scientific nature, this new medicine is infinitely human. It also gets along entirely without any animal experiments. The world is changing today. Should this deep state get defeated, it will quickly become apparent whether this system change was real or merely the next level in the same game. When we finally have a constitutional state again, Germanische Heilkunde will inevitably break through. Dr. Hummer was convinced of this, and so am I. I appreciate your attention. Helmut Pilhar, the father of Olivia.